Why do you think we lost? I mean, I think we're gaining some of this civic engagement because people, their attention has been gotten, right? Why do you think we lost it? I have some thoughts about where we think we
I think that the political class stopped communicating with the middle class.
Zach, what do you think? Where did we lose that sense of common identity as American citizens?
Well, again, going back to the media and this is not actually I don't want to actually be down on the media. I think that they have a hard job, and I think overall they actually do a very good job. This is more about people self-selecting into the information they get from the media, literally going to websites and only having people that agree with their point of view. What happened to that? There used to be 3 networks. You had Walter Cronkite reading you the news, right? And that was just the way it was. Now it's I mean, people are literally on one side or the other. And so I'm going to take a step back and say it's because I think we've lost a common set of understanding of what's a fact. We don't. Yesterday's a perfect example. I mean, you had one network, I'll let you guess which one, that literally did not cover at all the fact of the entire story of the day, and all the other media actually covering that story. Well, I mean, if you self-select into that network and you self-select into that via social media, I mean, you literally would not have any idea that this had even gone on, or you would buy into the narrative that this has all been a rigged system and it's all trying to bring somebody down. Look, if we can't agree that the sky is blue, legitimately, I think we have to have a fundamental agreement of what a fact is. And think about it, from science, from whatever it may be, we're now at a situation where we don't even agree what a fact is. We have alternative facts. Mm-hmm. We don't agree on what a fact is.
Adrienne?
So in my mind, it's very similar to what Zach said, is people are polarizing, selecting their information sources. I think in our lives, we've just been increasingly segregated and polarized, right? We spend time with people who are like us and think like us. We don't really, and we're very consumed with our own sort of comings and goings and challenges in life. And life is hard, right? I mean, it's hard in the best of circumstances, never mind for the majority of the population who lives in something less than the best of circumstances. So it's easy to take up all your time and energy just thinking how you're going to make it day to day. For those of us who have the luxury to not be thinking about, literally feeding ourselves day to day or keeping a roof over our head day to day, I mean, it really behooves all of us to say, what is somebody else going through, right? And really take a minute to think beyond our self-interest and put ourselves in our neighbor's shoes, or somebody, from the next county over even, or, somebody in the middle of the country or wherever it is, as opposed to seeking out information that confirms our own biases or sort of setting up these little echo chambers for ourselves. I think, the part of the shame of this past election was people to point at each other and say, like, these people are stupid, right? These people are crooks. Instead of trying to take a step back and think, why might this person be, feeling the way they are, talking the way they are, listening to the news sources they are, and really trying to see the world from that person's point of view. And I'm not trying to be Pollyanna about it. I mean, Zach and I have known each other for a long time. Like, I'm as cynical as they come. But, I think it really is important. And the more we sort of isolate ourselves, the harder it is to come to a common understanding about facts or to make compromise in politics.
But what's interesting about that point, how many people here are parents? I mean, a lot of people in the room, right? So I've got a 2.5-year-old, which is why I look tired right now. But what's interesting about them, I mean, people have, truly, your life changes when you have a kid. You have a completely different set of understanding and empathy for the world. I really believe that. When he was born, I wanted him to just have his life just be a blank canvas. He could paint whatever he wanted on it. I didn't even care. Still want that for him, as I think all parents do. What's interesting is that story is the same regardless of socioeconomic status in the United States, regardless of socioeconomic status across the world. There is a commonality, right? We are much more united than, for whatever reason, it's being portrayed as, and then we allow ourselves to agree that there are greater differences than there actually are. When we actually start having conversations about the commonality, it's very interesting, because when you're an elected official, you don't have the luxury of exclusively just representing your base. I mean, we represent a very disparate group within my district. I have some of the most conservative and some of the most liberal areas of Santa Cruz County all within my district. I have the highest unemployment and the lowest unemployment in certain precincts in my district. I mean, that's a unique thing. But we have to be able to speak to the entire electorate in order to be an effective elected official. But for some reason, on the grander scale, we're only rewarded for taking extreme positions. the media as well and people self-selecting in. So I don't understand. I think that the answer is in that. If you just took a small step back and said, where's my commonality with somebody else, you could easily break down that barrier. But then also give yourself the space to be willing to listen to why it is that person feels the way that they do.
And I would suggest, and I suspect you would agree with this, that it's very easy if you're a Democrat like I am to look at the other side and say it's all their fault. They're the ones who are rigid. They're the ones who are intolerant. But we see it on the left, and I don't believe in these false equivalencies where both sides do it. But I think this is one of those cases where it seems to me there's been a rise in intolerance and a kind of moralistic absolutism across the spectrum, where you get this, it's almost like the Jacobins in the French Revolution, where you are either 100% correct or watch out for the guillotine.
Well, I think that's the difficulty of even just starting the discussion to reach some kind of understanding of where there is compromise. Think of this issue on global climate change. We have members of Congress who are elected by people who want them, who support the idea that this is all hoax, that there is no such thing. So they're coming to Congress, and when you start talking about the EPA and everything like that, they want to get rid of it because this is all a hoax. They know it. And there is no ability to start a discussion on how do we find a middle ground here.
And this makes me wonder what happened to the Enlightenment. because this country came out of the Enlightenment, right, which was all about reason. And yet we seem to be at a time in history now where people are rejecting reason, where this whole idea of science is suspect, as you suggest. And I would say, I'm alarmed by people denying the human role in climate change, for example. But we see other forms, like people who are anti-vaxxers, for example. And there seems to be this new trend the last few decades to reject rationality as the foundation for discourse.
When Adrienne's bio was read off, you were impressed, right? I mean, I'm impressed, and I knew her bio. I mean, the degrees she had and this kind of stuff. But you remember even when then Senator Obama was running for president, I remember doing communications for him, how much he was attacked for functionally going to good schools. I mean, think about that for a minute, right?
Yeah.
And there's been this sense of that the elitism, the knowledge is a bad thing, that people having that level of intellect is actually a bad thing. I do think our side has lost touch in a lot of respects. We're good at speaking down with our knowledge to people. My family's from the Midwest, industrial Midwest. I was the first on my mom's side to go to college. She comes from a family of 8, used car salesman father, the whole thing, right? And they're my family. I mean, I don't think about them in any kind of different way. So I don't understand why our side communicates down and it's sensed that way across the country. But on the flip side, then I think is part of what makes us viewed as elites by having that level of education. It's actually spoken down upon to have those accomplishments. And that's a very strange thing, but we're seeing it now. You're talking about the Enlightenment. It's not a good thing to actually be a critical thinker. It's not a good thing to have those levels of education. It's viewed as something that's suspect by a lot of people.
Now, how did that happen? How did knowing stuff? There's a book published recently called The Death of Expertise. Tom Nichols, he's a professor at the Naval War College, and I'm reading this book now. It's fascinating. And he talks about the same thing. As a professor, he runs into people who feel like they've got nothing to learn from him. They reject the whole idea of expertise. One person's opinion, my opinion of finance is as good as Adrienne's, or of how Congress works is as good as Sam's. I'm still aware that's not true, but it seems like we're losing that. Where would that have come from? This hostility to reason, which and the flip side, as you say, unfortunately, is this condescension that people pick up from, especially it seems, well-educated liberals.
Yeah, and I think the hostility to reason. In some ways, it's not that there's something beneath that where people are looking and they're saying, well, all these educated people, all these well-reasoned people, and yet this system isn't working for me. And in my mind, that's sort of the root of it. And that's legitimate, right? There are any number of people, perhaps the majority of the people in this country, for whom
if you're
the
so
system
smart, why does my life
not
stink?
working, right? So then the natural, I think, corollary from that, rightly or wrongly, is to say, well, wait a minute, like you can't be that smart. You're not doing all that much better, right? I'm still struggling, and you're sitting, eating off of China patterned plates and talking about your fancy degrees, and and I think to Zach's point, to the extent you have, fancy degrees or you're roaming the halls of Congress, I think a lot of people, I mean, people forget how to connect and why they're there and the populations they're there to serve. And I remember, I think similar to Zach, my mother grew up in the housing projects in the Bronx. She was the oldest of 7. My father grew up in, middle-class neighborhood, segregated Baltimore. They met at Harvard Medical School, and then soon thereafter met Zach's dad. And I must have been 7 or 8. I remember saying something that must have been like really bratty to my mother about like being stressed about like my fancy private school that I was going to and like how much work I had. And my mother was like, "You don't know anything about stress, right? Like stress is coming home from school worrying that your stuff is going to be out in front of the apartment building because you've been evicted." Right? And I think she unleashed some string of expletives at me that was like pretty shocking at the time. Right? But she was like, and she was always very clear when I was growing up, like, you were born into this, right? You didn't really do anything to deserve the opportunities you have. And it was really ingrained in me growing up. And I think it's easy to forget for those of us who were born into opportunity that you really didn't do anything to deserve it, right? And for those, and you really do need to sort of go out of your way to remind yourself of that. And for people who are less well off, I think, it's hard to sort of make your voice heard because you're consumed with other things, very rightly so.
Remember, Bill Clinton got beat an incumbent president by saying it's the economy, stupid. And that hit people because they knew it was their own economy. But the Democrats lost the ability to communicate what they were doing to help people. I remember getting in huge fights on trade issues, on NAFTA and around here there was probably split on NAFTA, on the Asian trade agreement, overwhelmingly against it because of all the work the labor unions did. I always supported it because here we are in an international school and we're in an international community. We've got to be dealing with the rest of the world. But our party and our constituency doesn't allow us to do that because they think that we're gonna hurt people rather than help people. And I think we have to do a better job, those of us that have the privilege of knowledge and the privilege of information that we get from all our staffs and all the research that the Library of Congress and White House does. We have to do a better job of communicating to the electorate that there really is people out there, and if you work with our issues. I think Obamacare is a huge economic issue. I was talking to a gentleman last night at a student at UC Santa Cruz whose son is drastically in need of mental health care. He couldn't afford it until the Obamacare required that every insurance policy in the United States has to cover mental health and alcohol and drugs. And we're about to lose all that. And I think if the electorate really knew that we're going to lose that, they would react differently politically.
Difficult time communicating through emotion, or I should say on the progressive side of the parties and the Democratic Party. We could just do a better job telling the story. I mean, a lot of the things on the Obama administration, they did a lot of things right, but a lot of things that I would argue that they could have done better was actually telling that story about, on the emotional side, about the things that they were actually doing.